The only thing that you and I ever want is something better. So let's take a look at what's available in the world and what we can use and what we can discard so that we end up with better. Let's go back to a time before religion. We'll start there, and we'll go through the Jewish faith, Christianity, Muslims, real quick. And then let's take a look at the advantages, disadvantages, see what the takeaways are, and see how that affects us creating better lives. So consider that in the time of the Jewish faith, so we go back like way before Christ, and as people started to get beyond being scared by lightning and thunder and the different things that happen, moons, as they started to figure out the stars and started to figure out a little bit about what this planet is all about. One of the early things that people realized is that when death comes, that the body is still there, but there's something missing. Now, I don't want to assume that these people were stupid, like we might not have had the kind of language that we have these days, but consider where we are today. How many people realize that it's our spirit that goes and leaves the physical body there, and yet how much energy do we put into thinking about what does that spirit actually do? You know, like I've covered in many videos. For example, like thoughts, thinking, conscious, subconscious are all part of our spiritual being. They're very critical parts of our spiritual being because of our overall being, because our body can't even operate without them. And yet, if we try to put them on an operating table to see what they physically look like, we can't do that. So considering that if we go back to these people pre any type of religion, and they're trying to process just exactly how does the world work, the same as you or I would today, except in an entirely different time and space. So as they started to gather things, they started to learn things, they started to document. So now you get the start of the Jewish faith. And a lot of it, if you read the First Testament, is got to do, or not the First Testament, the Old Testament, is got to do with practical things about life, like how to prepare food, what to do, what to eat, what not to eat. And this came from people poisoning themselves and dying, and very possibly also that some of the things that they experienced weren't exactly true, but they got carried forward as beliefs. But let's say that in general, so they've got, in the Old Testament, we've got a lot of things that are good life guidance. Part of that, which I really appreciate from the Jewish faith, is, and don't get me wrong, I'm not sold on any particular religion. I'm just looking for what actually makes sense. What do I feel in my gut instinct is actually true? No different than what you're trying to do. And so what I appreciate from the Jewish faith is, so they've got this thing about living, about eating, about food, about how to be safe with food. And then they've got, by the time they got to the point where Jesus arrived, well, then we had evidence of a lot of merchants, a lot of people. They were bartering, selling stuff. There was a lot of financial trade. Now, I think this is where things go off the rails a little bit, is that when Jesus arrived, his primary goal was to get people to connect, to say, here, like, look, humanity, we've come this far, but we're really missing the point about what is our spiritual side. So while people were praying and they had their idea about the God they were praying to that was separate from us, like in many religions, God is deemed to be up there and we're down here and we're separate. We're not. It was not until Jesus came along that people started to say, okay, well, God is in us and God is around us, and we can do what Jesus did with God in us. Like, we have that power. So if we can look at Jesus as being an early day minimalist. So he looked at all these people that were dealing in wealth and money and whatever the currencies. And so where he got mad at the temple about people having this trade we have to look at him as a minimalist. He's saying here, forget all that, put that aside for the moment, and let's focus on what do we have as human powers in our spiritual being. How are we connected to God? And then he spent a bunch of years going through, showing people what's actually possible when we use our thoughts and our minds, our conscious and our subconscious, well aligned to create a lot of things, everything from a complete turnaround in health, complete different way of living in peace. There's no, like what he strongly promoted was there's no need for war. There's just accept people for who they are. People make a big deal that he sat with the sinners and everybody else. All he did, I don't think that he would even have looked at that point, because that itself creates a problem in that now you're separating people from. He sat with human beings of every stripe. And I don't think it's necessary to separate that into, oh, he sat with the bad guys, so he was just kind of, he sat with everybody. And when we stop putting up the separation, the barriers, then we can learn something from that. But let's take a look now. So do we throw out everything that the Jewish faith has? Or do we try to understand? Like, for example, I've listened to several rabbis. Now, I used to think a rabbi was a priest, but what I've come to understand, if I've got this right, is a rabbi is a teacher. And so now what we've got is not only have they figured out through centuries of how to be safe physically, like in food and everything else, but they've also figured out that by understanding finance, that we can actually live exactly what Jesus said later on, that we can have anything that we want. So if we want to live a minimalist life like what Jesus did, we can do that. If we want to live in abundance, we can do that. He didn't say not to do that. He just said, don't let it become your focus. So when we take lessons from the Jewish faith, so there's a lot of value there, we can actually learn, like listen to some of these rabbis, go on YouTube. People like Rabbi Lapin is one I heard, and there's no doubt many who are very well versed in life, in finance. And when you take what you can learn from these people and add that to what we learned from Jesus, and then consider that, so if we break down religion, so we've got, okay, so first there was nothing, then there was Jewish faith, and I could be missing a lot here, but this is just a broad overview. So then about 2,000 years ago, then Jesus came along, and about 300 years after Jesus, 350 years, if you look at the history on Syria, then the church started. So even though there's the belief, the Christian faith where they say that it started with Jesus, the concept started with Jesus, but the church itself didn't start till about 1,700 years ago, ballpark. And what happened with the church was you see, when we understand what's in the Bible and we understand what the church teaches, then we can see that there's 26 differences, like they're polar opposites between what the church teaches and what Jesus taught. So, like, start with simple things, like, for example, Jesus teaches us not to worry about tomorrow. Yet the church teaches us to worry about the biggest tomorrow that ever exists, is life after death. So which one do we follow? Which one do we trust? And do we somehow lie to ourselves and say, oh, they're actually mostly saying the same thing? It's just, well, no. The fact of the matter is you worry about tomorrow or you don't. Like, you can't be a warmonger and claim to be a Christian. You might convince yourself of that somehow. You might live in a group where people believe that. But the reality is if you're killing human beings, you're not a Christian. That's because they're two different things. Now, maybe you can see that as a church Christian, but not following Jesus. So now, then we go to about 600 years ago, where Muslims started. And it's interesting to read up on that, like the people that started that and how that all came about. And it's very strongly modeled on Christianity. And I think the reason for the start of the Muslim faith is that they saw that the church, so we had Jesus for 350 years, like that. Then the church came along and they took the idolization of Jesus and made that into a business. So between praying to Jesus, teaching people that they're weak and that they're separate from God, and then so in somebody's view, like I'm thinking, like in terms of Muslim, they're looking at, okay, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Where is this loving God? Where is this that Jesus was originally talking about? So we end up with a new faith that started about 600 years ago, based on a progress of what came along as Jewish, then became Christian, then became the church, then became in an attempt to clarify for humanity even further what's happening. So here we have that rough breakdown. Now, when we actually pay attention to what Jesus teaches, then you say, well, you can live a minimalist life, or you can have anything you want. And when people decide to do what they do, we're not to interfere in that. Any group that decides what they're doing, as long as they're not harming children, you can follow what you're doing without interference from other people. So then, when I've looked at all of this, and I spent time writing 5 books over a period of 2 years just to clarify all these thoughts, and then I finally came to the realization of the 24 life ingredients. So I looked at what kids do, how happy kids are, and yet by the time they go into teenage years, then they become anxious, depressed, suicidal. When people get to be adults, they're so disillusioned with life. I'm thinking, like, how does that happen? So when I started looking back, I said, okay, well, we're not actually born free. We're born pre-programmed, so brain trained into religion. So most of us are born either into a religion or we're born into a belief of no religion. But we're born with a belief about the existence or non-existence of religion. Then we're trained into what does a government need from us? What does government demand from us? Then, because technically it's all seen that we're property of the government, because the money of the country is based on the number of people. That was the original start of that. And so then you have education. So now we have business that needs a certain kind of people so that business thrives. We have education that meets the demand of business to create the paid slaves for business. We have so there's 4 groups: religion, government, business, and education, that all put layers on every human being, basically from the time they're born. It's there. We don't start without that. So as you can see, it's clear from that, how do we get to our better when everything that we've been brain trained for is for the purpose of all those 4 groups? We have to peel away all those layers and start to come to something that makes sense for us in our own human being, in our own gut instinct, something that we can trust at a core level and say, okay, well, wait a minute. If we can look after ourselves physically so that we don't get sick, so there's a lot of guidance, like I said, careful what you're eating and all that. Exercise. If we can learn to use the power of our thoughts to create our reality, which is what happens. People say, well, the law of attraction doesn't work. Yeah, if we look at it like a vending machine and here I want my $1 million and it's not coming out, and say, well, that doesn't work. But when we look at our life, are we ever really surprised about the way our life is? Or did we sort of feel, well, I kind of knew that's how it was going to be. That's because it was already in our subconscious from what we thought, what we believe, all the things that we already have on our subconscious autopilot. So when we change what we believe, when we change what we think, then we change the outcome. But while we might consciously want something, we might think about weight loss as two people. There's the larger person and then the thin person inside. And it's the larger person, so the conscious, that wants to return to being thin, but the subconscious is gotten used to the larger person. And so as you go through the process of losing weight, which I've done, I've lost like at least 30 kilos, then like, so 50, 60 pounds, right? And then in that process, you realize, oh, wait a minute, as you thin down, then you start to realize this doesn't feel right, because I've been so used to having that belly and everything else that when I start to lose it, now all of a sudden I have to go through a transition of actually this feels right to come back to who I was originally was as in my weight. And so we've got this constantly, 99% of everything in our life is controlled by our subconscious. Think about from the time that you wake up till you go to sleep, how many things are done on autopilot? These are all habits that are in our subconscious. So the subconscious is the driving force behind what our life is. Like everything we do, every micro experience creates the macro experiences. So whether it's the kind of sleep we have, the kind of breakfast we have, the kind of day we have, the kind of month, holiday, education, whatever macro experiences starts with every single micro experience. So then if we say, okay, well, if we want better financial understanding, well, why not listen to one of these rabbis who's spent their lifetime as a culture, as a group of people understanding how finance works? And if we want peace in our life, why not understand what Jesus was actually teaching? Put aside what the church teaches, because the church is at polar opposites with what Jesus was teaching. And the end result of all of this is what I've done is put together so many free coaching videos on the 24 Life Ingredients, because whether you're starting about what is life, challenge you to answer that question for yourself in about 5 seconds, and most people can't do it. Most people come up, oh, that's a good question. And yet we live life and we don't even know what we're living. So as you get into the 24 Life Ingredients, and the links will be here, you just look for the links on YouTube on the videos here. As you explore them, don't expect to hear things that you already know. When you listen to them, they might sound different, but they're also going to sound oddly familiar, because these are things that you knew as a kid. These are the things that you might not have been able to write out as a kid or put into words, but on a subconscious level, you knew them. They feel right. Now, while the church teaches people that we're not perfect and there's no such thing as perfect, life actually teaches us that everything is perfect. And you can see there's a huge conflict there. And you say, well, no, wait a minute, buddy, you're crazy. Like, that makes no sense. Like, we all know, ask anybody, nobody's perfect. We know this. It's okay. If you want to continue living the life you live, then continue believing the things you believe, and you'll keep getting the results that you get. And if you're enjoying anxiety, depression, alcoholism, using drugs, living in a society where there's no decent relationships, where everything is stress and things are geared towards war and hatred, then by all means, knock yourself out. But if you're looking at saying there's got to be something better than this, then we can't arrive at better results by using the same methods that we've used. We've got to think differently. And so you can always go back to believing that things are broken and imperfect. But what happens when you discover that perfection doesn't mean that there's nothing wrong in the world, that there's nothing about, that there isn't war and murder and rape and all kinds of horrible things? But when we understand that in order to have freedom, to have true free will, every possibility has to exist. Because by the time that we eliminate any possibility, then we've reduced things down to a minimal. So if we went around and asked everybody in the world, what do you think should be removed? and everybody had their list of stuff, and all at the end, let's say, for example, all that's left over is a warm, sunny beach with a drink. Well, all you've got is 7 billion people sitting on a beach with a drink, and that's it. That's life, because that's the only option. Now, just because the ugliness exists doesn't mean we have to use it. The fact that it exists allows the possibility for the opposite to be there. So when there's war, then there's peace. And if we can finally understand how to use our thoughts to create our personal world, like, you're not going to go out and change the world when we don't change ourselves. So when we decide that everything is perfect and we start to live that way, and we start to respect other people, and we start to acknowledge that the people are different and there's nothing wrong with that, then we've already taken a big step forward. When all the war exists, we don't have to have war. It's a possibility, but it doesn't have to exist. But it only exists because we insist on making other people wrong. We decide to see, well, they're not perfect. They need to be like us. We all need to be sitting on the beach with a drink, and then life will be fine. That's not how life works. Life shows us that everybody can be different. Everybody can do what they can pursue what they feel is right. You consider that when people go out and kill other people, it's because they've been antagonized, they've been belittled, they've been brought down by other people. This isn't like whether it's the war in the Ukraine right now or any other thing else. That's been started by a group of people who antagonized another group. So in this case, it was the U.S. and NATO and the Western allies that have, over the last 8 years, brought this situation to a boil where now Russia is being and further antagonized by the West, shutting everything down to make the lives of those people miserable, to make the life of the leader more difficult, to leave no other option but to create a war that they've been instigating for the last 8 years. So if we can back off from that, if we can start to move towards actually, instead of saying, well, here I'm all in favor, oh, those poor people in that particular part are being hurt by that part, and ignore that we were the cause of that in the first place, then we'll never make progress. No war was ever stopped by starting a war. And so when we start with ourselves and we say, okay, let's consider that what we know is wrong. Let's say that the world is actually perfect as it is. And that if I can look at people as being perfect as they are, then I change my view of them. I'm no longer fighting with them. I'm understanding them. I may not be in alignment with them, but it doesn't mean that I'm right or that they're right. It just means we're different. Now, when you think about a relationship, originally people get together and they're in love, and what happens then? What is it, the 7-year mark, and things go horribly wrong? Well, it's still the same person. We've all grown, but now all of a sudden we've found a bunch of things that is not perfect about that person anymore. And the next thing you know is people are getting divorced, and they get ugly divorces, and all of a sudden there's nothing good about that person anymore. What happened? The only thing that happened is we stopped seeing them as being perfect as they are, the way we did when we got together. And so when we can return to that, and when we can understand that people grow apart or they grow together, and if we can see things as being perfect as they are, and understand that love is seeing everything as being perfect as it is, because if you say that you love a person, but you'd love them more if they were something different, then you don't love the person. You love your image of what that person would be if they were different. And that there's a huge difference there. Now, as we go through all of the life ingredients, and as we start to internalize them, then one of the first things that happens is that we come to peace ourselves. And from that peace, we start to make better decisions. We start to create better relationships. We start to create better businesses. We start to create better lives. But to wrap this all up, what we've got is when we look at, okay, there was a lot about the the Jews that they got right. There might have been a few things that they got wrong, but then Jesus expanded on that. We understood more about spirituality. We started to understand that, okay, what actually happens when we drop dead? What happens, and how do we use that spirit while we're alive? How do we use our thoughts to create the kind of power that Jesus had when he was alive? Consider that he spent out of the 3 years, he spent about a year training his disciples, and then the next 2 years they went off and did what he did. Maybe not quite as powerfully, but well on the way. Significantly different than anything that you see in the church today. So, and I don't want to say that the church entirely is bad. Of course, it has a lot of bad points, but there's a lot of people in the church that have extremely good intentions, that bring extremely good value to their communities. So we can't just say that, okay, well, that church is horrible because they've done so much damage to so many kids, or that they've been preaching the opposite of what Jesus has been teaching. There's the people in the organization. It's not, everything is not entirely bad. And the same thing with I say about America and NATO and the wars. That not all Americans are bad, but there are a lot of people who have been brain trained into believing that war is the answer to peace. But in actual fact, when you go and fight in 94 countries and you're the instigator of those wars, you got to kind of say, well, wait a minute, let me go back a step here and say, would that war have even existed if our people hadn't have taken other actions to trigger them? And if we can't or don't want to face that, well, then we're going to continue living in the kind of misery that we live in, or the belief that it's okay to kill other human beings, no matter what we label them as the enemy, so it makes it okay to kill them. But then talk to the people who were brought into that position, and when they come back from those wars, how mentally damaged they are for the rest of their lives. And then you got to question, like, is this really what we wanted to do to our sons and daughters? So as we look for better in our lives, we can know a couple of things. Life teaches us that life is a series of connected and related experiences. That means that we can decide every micro experience. If I don't like the way I'm waking up in the morning, I can do something about that by going to sleep earlier, going to sleep with different thoughts in my mind, changing my career, changing my job, change things. I can change anything. And I will never change the big thing all at once, but I will change little things, and the little things change the big things. So life is fully within our control. Like it was probably Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, either way you're right. The reality is that once we start to do just one little thing, and then start to do the next little thing, 4 or 5 little things like that, and you'll be astounded at the amount of energy that you've built, the momentum, the inspiration, the motivation that you get from that. It's not complicated. Life guides us to show us that everything is perfect as it is, that we have a phenomenal amount of power as human beings, and that when we tap into that power, the universe is behind us, helping us to achieve everything that we're setting out to do. So follow me. If these videos are useful, I would appreciate if you went to Bark, which is an app where I advertise my coaching services, and I would appreciate honest referral or a reference there. And in the meantime, look at the other videos, follow up, join us on our weekly conversations where we have online Zoom calls where we talk about all this, everything about life. Where are you stuck? What do you need to know next? What do you want? What do you need to do? And I'll help you move forward in your life. So all the best, and we'll talk.